Yay. Uh, so we're here to look at troubled times in America, but I want to ask, and this may require you to unmute. I would just very quickly ask, you saw what this class is about. What is it you're hoping this class will be about? What are you hoping you might learn from this today? If anybody's got any input on that, I would appreciate it. So it's always nice to make sure we're lining up for where we're going. So troubled times in America, and this one, it says 1825. I think the book says to 1860. It's probably going to go a little earlier to a little closer to 1850, 1855. But anybody, anything you're looking for, what you're hoping to find out in this series of classes?
For me,
Go ahead.
For me, I think I would like to. I'd like to put what we're going through or have been through the last 5 or 6 years into perspective with the rest of our history. The last several years have been a roller coaster. If you're going back to 2016, it feels like we've been riding a roller coaster, and I'd like to put that in perspective.
Okay, that's excellent, and I'm going to address all of these when we get. If anybody else would like to give their feelings, but that is very good, Joan, and thank you, because that's one of the reasons I want to do it, is just I want to put it in perspective. That's a good way to say it. Anyone else? Carol?
I was just going to refer to the email you sent us and how you listed the things that happened during that time frame. And it couldn't hurt to tell you, it just hit me that I thought that's just what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
And that's scary.
It is on that point. There are definitely some similarities. I don't like to overdraw similarities, but you've all heard me use the Mark Twain line that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And this is, you're going to hear some things tonight that are actually a bit surprising at how well they rhyme. And on another level, they are things that are pretty early on, because one of the things we're going to do today, you notice I'm starting quite a ways back. That's really because by the time we get to about 1850 to 55, we might already have started to slip down the slope. Everybody always talks about, well, that's a slippery slope. We might have already hit the slide by 1850 or so to say, I'm not sure we can correct this. What you're going to find tonight is we might be hearing about some things that are quite a ways before that time period. So that might, a little foreshadowing, that might give you a little point of relaxation. If there's anybody else, I'd love to hear it. Sandy, anyone, just what you might be hoping to hear or learn about.
Well, I like the fact that we get your perspective based on things that you studied and books that you've read. Like last week was kind of a sleeper. I mean, I don't recall knowing much about her at all. And it was wonderful, the information that you presented. And I think that's what I'm looking forward to tonight.
Okay, well, thank you. And that's what I'm hoping to do. And that, to be honest, everybody, one of the things I want to make sure I do not do in this series, I am not looking just to find things that match. I'm trying to tell you what I see happened. And if they have a match today, you can make that connection quite possibly. I might point to it, but I'm not just looking to find the things that are exact matches. And I'm definitely do not want to find myself in a situation where I'm grabbing something and stretching it over here to make it match. And I'm saying that because quite sincerely, this series is a bit of a departure for me in the fact that I am trying to go back and say there are a lot of times in America's history that we have been in a rough period, a period where people do not seem to want to get along with each other, that do not seem to value the great American experiment in self-governance, or they feel that self-governance only applies to them, not to the people they don't like. But if you look at that list that I put in that we're going to look at, we have a lot of those times in our history. The reason tonight's may be a lot more heavy lifting than the rest of them is this is the only one that ends up in literally a shooting war. And one of the things I want you to realize is I'm going to spend a lot more time in the early part of that 1825, even actually a little earlier than that. I'm going to spend a lot more time in that early part so that we're well grounded and realize that my personal feeling is a lot of those things kept tumbling forward without being fixed, and they kept repeating. And thus, by 1850, without being able to find a solution, they just finally started sliding down that slope toward that hot war. And thus, to me, it's a lot more important to look back to the earlier times and see, well, why didn't that happen in 1810? Why didn't that happen in 1827? Why didn't that happen in 1835? Because they did willingly work together. And they did try to find methods to compromise. Now, not all of those are good, and that's going to be something I'm going to want you looking at. But with that said, I'm ready to start. I hope you are, and we'll get going here. We're looking at America's troubled times, and I'd just like to start this out. On July 4th of 1826, John Adams, a dedicated revolutionary who turned out to be the second president of the United States. He was that scold that pushed and worked hard to get people to realize the situation they were in with the British, that we had already stepped into a revolution you can't try to make nice. On July 4th, 1826, he's laying in his deathbed, and as his last chance to speak, his last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." Other books put it down, "Thomas Jefferson still lives." And in the context of what he had been talking about and saying, what he was really saying is there is still hope for this country, because the brilliant light that is Thomas Jefferson and his intelligence is still there, is still available, even though his was diminishing and being extinguished. Now, you have to remember that during his presidency, the most vexing opponents he had were the people on his side. Thomas Jefferson specifically, who was his vice president. And of course, the other one, Alexander Hamilton, who was an absolute worse than pain in the neck, who made his life hell as president. Both of these men did. Yet here he is on his deathbed, 50 years after the fact, and 25 years after his presidency saying, these are the people I think of. He was bitter over his treatment as president, and he had withdrawn from Jefferson, who he'd once had treated as much as if he were a son to him. Yet years later, after both their presidencies, they would reconnect by mail. And if you've never read their letters, you have to understand their dialogue, is really the finest political discourse and discussion of events and ideas and political topics you will ever read. And honestly, I would not be doing these classes today if it hadn't been for those letters, for those discussions. And they're fascinating because what you find, and I've said this many times, Thomas Jefferson is a great PR man. The reason we love him so much is because we're told how lovable and great he is, but most of that is because he wrote his own PR stuff. And John Adams, one of the reasons we know he's a pain in the neck and a scold and everything else is because all the people that he's pushing wrote about that too. But reading their dialogue is incredible. The interesting thing is that both men would die that same day, July 4th of 1826, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the declaration which neither could have achieved this alone, and is perhaps their finest moment. And yet, as Adams had said that statement, he was incorrect. Thomas Jefferson, revolutionary leader, third president of the United States, had already died earlier that same day. Now, what that really means is at the 50-year mark, we were experiencing the passing of the generation. These were really the last of the men who had created, waged, and pushed forward the war of the American Revolution. They were both old men by then. Adams was 90, Jefferson 83. Now Adams had been in very good health and had been doing very well, though Jefferson had been declining for quite a while. And this was their last thoughts, their last moments, in many ways were of each other because of the things they had done. They had done it with George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton. Those were some of the mainstays and the people who would sign that incredible Declaration of Independence. And remember as well, the idea is just that, a Declaration of Independence, and they had survived. All of these men had survived, and the country had survived the Revolution. They survived a failed first attempt at government, the Articles of Confederacy. They would survive a disastrous follow-up war with Great Britain, the War of 1812. Yet just a few years before their death, Thomas Jefferson would write, "I regret that I am now to die in the belief that the useless sacrifice of the generation of 1776 is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons, and my only consolation is that I will not live to weep over it." It's actually likely not a moment too soon that these men were stepping off the stage. Monumental events had overtaken the country, and the results are tearing at the paper bonds, the literal paper bonds of the agreement of the Constitution that these men and many others had come together to create and preserve the American public. And that is our story. And over the next number of weeks, we're going to look at other times in American history. But Jefferson is well aware, just before his death, that a huge issue has arisen that will likely eventually tear the Union apart. Yet it's not something that had ever been hidden. It was something that had been in plain sight all along. So my concept for this class is the American experiment in self-government has frequently been in trouble over our entire lifetime. And you're going to see me talk about this. This is within 20 years of creating this. They had some problems. They have been in trouble, and we're going to examine those times. And what I'm hoping to find is what caused these troubles and how did they avoid destruction? How did they avoid dissolution? Because that is the issue. You know, what stopped them from falling apart then? You know, and I'm old enough to remember when the theory was, because remember, we have said from the very beginning that the American Revolution and the idea of self-government was so outrageous, was so incredible that, you know, only a genius or a madman could have thought it could ever have worked. And the biggest point is thus for it to have lived, to have survived, you know, to make it past the revolution, that it must have been a gift from God, right? And thus what always went with that was the follow-up of that we had the right people to lead us out of it. And for many, many years, if you studied American history, and if you go back and read the older books, you will be indoctrinated in the concept of, you know, the strong man, the right man at the right time arising. And yes, they used the term man because that at that time was the only one who could have gotten there. And there is something to be said about that. If you think about this, you know, we've mentioned Jefferson, we've mentioned Adams, and both of them incredible. And of course, you had to have George Washington or it wasn't going to happen. But then on top of that, you got Alexander Hamilton, who figured out how to make a system that would allow it to not just fall into debt and destruction. But more importantly than that, they had probably one of the most brilliant minds of his time, you know, who was the key negotiator for the peace after the long war with Great Britain. And he was there at that precarious moment in time. And though it was difficult, he achieved a signed treaty and would stay in France until 1785, continuing to oversee and to be the liaison for America with Europe and with Great Britain. And then, as I said, we step forward and we've got the very first government, the Articles of Confederation, which proved completely inadequate on two issues. And you'll never believe what those two issues are: taxation and authority. Oh my, could that be? No, we said, you know, no taxation without representation. Well, you got complete representation. Oh no, we just don't like taxes, and that's all there is to it. And this point is driven home when after the revolution and everything else, when the farmers in Western Massachusetts who object to the taxes being put on alcohol products, you know, begin to arise and revolt, it became clear very quickly that a stronger government was required. And thus, you know, when Massachusetts said, "Please help, we don't have a standing army, we can't put these people down." Of course, the Articles of Confederation was like, "Well, we don't have anybody, we don't have anything, and besides, that's in your backyard, so that makes it your problem, not ours." So between that and all of the navigation issues on the waterways that pass between two states, because just as today, most of those rivers pass between two or three states, and each side wanting to do something to it which harms the other, it was very clear that a stronger government would be required if it was going to make it at all. And it's Thomas Jefferson and all the rest, they're on doing other things. We have to come up with something new. And you have that new beginning, and they end up having a constitutional convention. But they are getting down toward the end of it. Originally just to fix the Articles of Confederation, no, they just toss that out. We need a more powerful government. And yet, by the end, it's falling apart. They are not, by the end of the convention, they are not finding the way forward. But it is, again, Benjamin Franklin that holds the key of joining people with differing opinions together. And he does that not with speeches, but with conversations. It is Benjamin Franklin that leads the way to compromise on the issue of representation. There was that fear in the small states, well, we don't dare join in, we'll just be run over. We do not have, representation based on the number of people. That's just not going to work. And it is Franklin, of course, who comes forward with the idea of a Senate where every state has 2 representatives, and that the 2 have to work together, can stop everything. And I guess I will just mention, this is a method he first proposed in the Albany Agreement in 1754. And where did he get that idea from? Where did all this come from? Well, remember our discussion of the Iroquois? Yes, that's where it all came from. Now, this is a well-known story, but as he's leaving the building after they have put this all together, a woman confronts him and says, "What kind of government have you given us?" And he snaps back, "A republic, madam, if you're strong enough to keep it," because he clearly knew it would take effort. That all of these independent states trying to be harnessed together to pull the wagon forward, that they would have great difficulties. And more importantly, no republic, even remotely as large as this, had ever survived. And he meant it when he said, if you are strong enough to keep it. Because one of the questions that everybody has, the reason a republic can't work, is you can always just vote for the things you want and try to ignore the things you don't. Now, Franklin would be the first of the group to pass in 1790. He's 84 years old. And on his passing, Jefferson would remark, "A great and dear friend whom time will be making greater while it is expunging us from its records." Jefferson was always very good at the self-effacing statements, but he meant it. Franklin truly was the genius of the era and recognized as such by most of Europe. Now, Adams, when he spoke of Franklin, was a little bit more biting, perhaps. History will assume that Dr. Franklin's electrical rod smote the earth and outsprung General Washington, that Franklin electrified him with a touch of his rod, and thenceforward these 2 conducted all the policy negotiations, legislatures, and the war. Adams was just always felt a little cheated that nobody recognized his contribution as being as great as they should have. Now, France, in remembering Franklin, would just say he snatched the lightning from the skies and the scepter from the tyrants. And that is so true. But remember, Franklin would have greatly appreciated that line, but at the same time, Franklin and all of these other men knew firsthand that you must always fear the mob as well. In this picture, the men holding down one of the British tax commissioners, who you'll notice has already been tarred and feathered and being force-fed the tea that is being taxed, underneath the Liberty Tree where a noose is hanging, just to make the point. Franklin and especially Adams were both very, very aware of just how powerful and scary the mob could be, and realized that that was always going to be an issue going forward for being strong enough to have that republic, because protest was common in the days before the revolution, and that protest, especially after the Stamp Act and things like that, quite often the mob would turn on the house of the person who got the job as commissioner and destroy it. They would strip it bare, not on the inside, from the outside in, and leave it as such. It was nothing short of intimidation, and they were very good at it. But I would just ask you, really, what was the Boston Tea Party? Remember, in today's dollars, that was millions of dollars of product thrown into the Boston harbor. You know, it was a political protest, but it was definitely an expensive one. But with the passing of this generation, and with the passing of Adams and Jefferson, where we're starting, the original leaders of the American Revolution are all gone. You know, so with this, it is going to be on those who now occupy the space. And yes, some of them were the people who had helped create the Constitution, Madison most especially, but the ones that had lived through the Revolution are the ones that are largely gone. Remember, Monroe, whose presidency would end just before these two men died, was the last of the revolutionaries to occupy the presidency. Well, let's remember some of the changes, because one of the things I want to stay focused on is what's happening at the same time that might be causing or might have something to do with these issues, these changes, all of these things that are going on. And remember, in 1810, this is an actual statement. It cost more to move a barrel of wheat from your farm in rural Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, 30 miles. It cost more to move that barrel of wheat 30 miles than it did to move it 3,000 miles from Philadelphia across the Atlantic to London. You know, a 57-mile stagecoach journey from Boston to Cape Cod took 12 hours, and that was with multiple stops and a lot of changes. You know, what's happening, though, is the Industrial Revolution is on us. You've heard me talk many times that the steam engine, and thus the steamboat, is beginning in America by 1807. And within a decade, this revolutionizes travel going upstream as well as down. Because as everybody had moved across, not everybody, but as all the people who were going to moved across the Appalachians, we have to remember the lack of roads, because nobody's responsible for the roads. If you want a road, you built it yourself. Well, what's that mean? Well, it means the roads aren't very good. They're just trails that were broken, maybe by the first people out there, maybe by the people who needed it. But when you cross the Appalachians, most people did not cross back. And from what I just told you, gee, in Pennsylvania, in the flatlands, it costs as much to move a barrel of wheat. Imagine what it would cost to go over the Appalachians. So what happens, of course, is as they find the Ohio River, as they find, you know, these water tributaries, they, of course, start sending everything downstream. And that's why we see Louisiana is one of the first states on the other side. Now, of course, we have Tennessee and Kentucky, which truly, I believe, are the first that come in, because you go through the Cumberland Gap, an easy way across to the southern side. And on the northern side, many people would go up the Hudson, find where the mountains were far lower, and come around that side, and then down to the western part of Pennsylvania, which meant Virginia, who's adjacent to it, had already made it up into that western end of Pennsylvania. But with all of that, the country is growing. And as it grows, this transportation, sending all those goods far cheaper than trying to go by wagon back across the mountains. They all get sent out by the rivers lead to the Mississippi leads to the Gulf, and again we're into the cheap shipping. Now remember as well, you see here the Michigan Territory. Again, that's territory, which means there are natives there, and they aren't necessarily interested in giving up their space. But as America is expanding, they will be dealt with in one aspect or another, and that's going to become an important part, because the aspect usually is, if you can get along, then the government's going to sign a treaty with you. And the idea is, under Washington, many treaties were signed, and they were observed and continued to be observed, that you could stay on your land. But if you fought, as Tecumseh, if you fought, then the fighting would continue until one side or the other quits, and it was almost always the natives. Now, remember, this is the era of Jeffersonian ideals, and Jefferson was dedicated to the idea of independent farmers, who would manufacture all their own goods. He did not believe in credit, because he knew credit was a case of a bank that would push control. If you had to get money from the bank, then you owed that money, and now the bank has an upper hand on you. And if they were going to deal with money, it wasn't going to be something where somebody had just signed their name and said this piece of paper was worth so much. The belief, it had to be hard money. It had to be coins. It could be bank notes, but they had to be truly guaranteed bank notes, not a piece of paper that just said, this bank guarantees this much. That's the Jeffersonian ideal. But even by the late 1810s, that's going to be going away, because remember, Jefferson had tried to avoid a war with Great Britain, just as Washington did, just as Adams would. They would rely on negotiation instead. But now, with that entire group either getting too old or passing from the scene, the elections of 1910 are now suddenly bringing men who didn't exist on the coast. They are the backwoodsmen. They are the ones from that area where they have been fighting with nature, possibly with natives, and all of them know the problems that the British, who supposedly had given up all interest past the mountains after the Revolutionary War, they're now back in there and making deals with the natives. All of these people are war hawks. They want to stop Britain, and not having been in the revolution, don't realize what that really means. And as those leaders take control in the House, remember, one of the things that had been done for years, we did not have a two-party system. It's just the one party still at this point, although with the advent of Jefferson, people are coalescing around him as opposed to the people around Hamilton. And you are seeing signs that look like a two-party system, but the Congress would still decide, we think this person should be the person running for president. And then quite often somebody else would oppose them, not necessarily on ideological lines, although that's what happened with Adams and Jefferson, but to say, well, here is an alternative. Madison had succeeded his mentor, Jefferson, and Madison was given notice toward the end of his first term that if he wanted the nomination, if he wanted to be anointed by the Congressional Caucus for re-election, he would have to agree to screw up his courage and request a declaration of war with Great Britain. Now, of course, Madison doesn't want anything to do with that, but he does want to remain president. And this does show the power of the party, does it not? That they are the ones who are saying to the people who are really the electors in the Electoral College, this is the person we think should be president. and those electors usually followed suit. Now, these war hawks have a brilliant plan. The British are fighting Napoleon, so they really don't have anybody around. There's only 5,000 troops in Canada. We'll take it to use as a hostage to force Britain's good behavior, both on the high seas and in the backwoods area. Because Britain has been doing terrible things. They in need of accomplished sailors, and their sailors keep jumping ship when they reach port in America. They're boarding American ships and saying, oh, look, you can read, you can write, you can do these things. You must really be a British citizen, and they're removing them. So the Hawks are angry, and they do force Madison to follow their plan. And we have a declaration of war on June 1st of 1812. But nobody in the North wants this war. All of the people in the North are they're moving toward manufacturing. They're moving toward a lot more need of interaction with Britain and everybody else. They're going, this is not the right way to go. And not a single Federalist, which is the party that Washington and Adams had belonged to, will vote for it. And none of the New Englanders. It will be the closest vote ever for war, and it will be a disaster because they have forgotten what Ben Franklin had tried to tell them. There was never a good war or a bad peace. Clearly, we can see Franklin's leadership and his message is missed. Now, remember, the other thing, though, pushing these items is the fact that we're starting to have more communication now that we have faster communication via these steamboats and being these waterways and everything else. Papers are starting to move more. And remember, Franklin himself had made a living as a newspaper and pamphlet publisher. And there are newspapers out there now. And you'll notice they always have a lot of telling cartoons, as, here is Jefferson clearly being caught in the act of trying to burn the Constitution, and the American eagle is stopping him while God watches, because God watches over America. And we see it continually, as the parties are separating, you get more and more of this. We have more communications. The pamphlets have grown to what are called broadsides, and it's where we get the concept of an article or an opinion piece blasting somebody. These large sheets of paper that they printed on, would be called a broadside, and thus the statements made in them that are caustic will become known as firing a broadside at the person, just as you would on a ship in naval war. But newspapers are becoming more timely. It's no longer just, well, I published one today, and when we run out of these, we'll publish another one. They're selling, plus they're selling advertising. And remember, if selling is the most important point, that means that the accuracy of the news might not be the most important point, right? They're often based on salacious gossip or statements that can't be verified. And this will lead, in the case of Adams was getting pounded constantly in the papers. It caused him great grief. Now, how wise was this war? By August of 1814, two years later, British troops have captured and burned Washington. We have seen that. Remember that concept that they were going to take Canada. What happened? This is a very telling point. Remember, they're all independent states, right? So every independent state has its own militia. And when the army officers with their forces came north to say, okay, we're going to go over and we're going to try to invade Montreal, or we're going to try to invade Canada, where there's only the 5,000 troops supposedly. From the very start, it goes badly because the militia officers say, well, what gives you authority over us? You, Mr. Army man, you don't have any authority over us. We're all independent, each of us. And this, of course, is an aspect of that whole concept of the independent states, isn't it? And remember, one of the great concepts that comes out of this war, is but our flag is still there. It's our national anthem. Fort McHenry holds out, saving Baltimore, even though Washington's already been sacked. So Washington, the city. And remember as well, we said that Jefferson didn't like banks and worked to get rid of them, didn't like deficit spending, avoided that no matter what, unless, well, there's 14 million for this great plot of land that goes between, from the Missouri all the way up to the Canadian border. By 1815, a year later, Madison has to tell Congress, the budget is depleted. We are existing on borrowed money. We cannot sustain this war. It's a failure. And he sends Henry Clay, one of the guys, the war hawks, who had pushed for the war. Now he turns around and sends Henry Clay and others to negotiate a peace with Great Britain. Now, actually, Great Britain had tried to avoid the war. They realized they were probably overstepping. And yes, they were fighting with Napoleon and didn't really want to do the war. But now that they're in it, it's been going well, but they're tired of fighting. They're not going to they're not going to retake the country. It's not going to happen. They propose to return things to the status of pre-war while the negotiators are over there, John Jay and Henry Clay. They will get a treaty and get it signed. But of course, not everyone's going to get that message. And the British are marching. It is heard that the British are going to march and try and take New Orleans. And of course, New Orleans is where all those goods that come down the Ohio and over to the Mississippi and past the states of Mississippi. That's where all of that comes out to go to market. Andrew Jackson, an experienced commander and fighter, hears this and double times his troops to get to New Orleans and to build redoubts and invest them with his troops. And it's one of the most decisive, the very few decisive victories, very few victories, period, that the Americans will have on the ground. I should say that surprisingly, and it's one of the reasons Britain was glad to end the war, the Americans have been very effective on the naval war against the world's greatest naval power, Great Britain. They embarrassed them repeatedly with their victories. But on the ground, the Americans lost repeatedly. This is one of the few battles they won't. And really it's because, and one hates to say this about humans, it was Bunker Hill again, all over again. The British just marched across the flat land to try to take it, positive that the Americans would run. And the Americans in cover just continually pot-shotted them. And the results were tragic for the British. Less than 300 Americans would be casualties, and something like 2,300 Britishers would be. It was a very decisive and very costly battle, and it'll be costly in a couple of other ways too. When Clay and Jay get back with the treaty, they find the city is celebrating the great victory in New Orleans. Here they get to Philadelphia and it's like, what are we celebrating? Oh, we just whooped them in New Orleans. But, I often make the comment that you learn more from your losses than your victories. People did learn from both sides of this, but some people learned part of the wrong message. What's the meaning of all this? And what were the larger results of this war? In the end, Madison, an original Jeffersonian who believed in agrarians with their own private farms, nobody in debt to anybody else. And like Jefferson against a bank, now embraces the entire concept of a bank and its renewal. Why? Because without money, there were no ships. Without money, there was no army. Madison came up against the reality of, without the banks to loan the money to create the arms and armaments, it wasn't going to happen. And he also realized that we can increase the spending. Henry Clay now, for all of his part, even though he was wrong off the start, somehow seems to recover. And by being one of the ones who comes back with a treaty, is recognized as a power in the House. And he has ambitions. He has his eye on larger things, notably the presidency. The Federalists, the party of Washington, the party that had always been the important party, who was right about the war from the very start, the ones who did not vote for it, they become tainted goods. This war will kill them. It's a slow death, but it kills them because just before the end, they threatened to secede from the Union, if the war was not stopped. And their timing was as terrible as they could possibly get, and they will be held up as traitors for the rest of their lives. Essentially, you may still have Federalists that were Federalists hang on as Federalists, knowing they had been right, but they will gain no new cohorts, no new people in their party. It is a dead party. It will hang on. It'll have some impact, but it is not going to grow. Now, the other change between the embargo, between the war, the federal government has somehow attained new powers to be, because they had to, in these emergency situations, use those powers. And as such, they've kept those powers. And at the same time, farmers who during the embargo found that they didn't really have a place for their market to go to, had started moving into actually go to work as manufacturers. Now, what that probably meant was you were an apprentice at that time, but manufacturing is on the rise. Rather than staying home and when you're not in the field building your own homespun clothing, as we'd see Franklin wear, now the idea is manufacturing is starting to get a lead. But another person takes one thing out of this war, which is he was always right and he'd been in charge. It wouldn't have been just New Orleans that they won, but all of it. And he's that man on the horse. It is Andrew Jackson, right? Now, remember, Adams was another one of those who had clear insight on things. He spoke often of the worry about people being able to vote for who they want as president. You would always have to be on the lookout for the rise of the man on the horse, the bold leader of armies. And a Napoleon as such was always feared by, because they were a natural enemy of a republic, of a government of laws, because no one did fear them for that, and they did not realize that these men would just take the law into their own hands. So realize that now with the steamship and the Erie Canal, a transportation revolution by 1820 is occurring. The trains would be coming along in 1825. The Erie Canal is completed in 1825. We have to remember that concept of the Erie Canal was laughable to most people. They felt that Governor Clinton of New York was insane to even consider. I'm going to go back to that picture, to even consider what that looked like, how far you would have to go, to get to the Hudson, which would take you out to the Atlantic from, Lake Erie over by Buffalo. And that laughter was heard for a long time, but not forever, because while it cost $7 million and the only people that would have that kind of money was the government of New York, it would pay back 121 million over its lifetime. So quite clearly, Clinton gets the last laugh. And as I said, the farmers now are able to produce goods that isn't going to be just consumed by their family or by a nearby neighbor. They're going to be turning out goods that are going out elsewhere. Now, the North, though, turns to industrialization. And the farmers then are just producing excess food stuff. In other words, they're growing the grains, they're growing the beans and the gourds, to ship out for food. They're not to be changed into anything else. The South, on the other hand, has begun to specialize in cotton, and those middle states on the eastern seaboard, as it has been since the 1600s, are producing tobacco. And remember, the cotton has become more important because with the cotton gin, they're able to turn out so much more. And we're going to talk about what that means too. But here's the thing we got to remember: as industrialization has increased, knowledgeable workers are needed. And the northern states are where the majority of the industrialization is. And that's one of the reasons why the northern states would embrace education. They knew they needed to prepare the workers. And in doing so, their innovations would impress the Europeans, because the Europeans, all the workers in Europe, fought against industrialization. They said, no, we're going to stay journeymen. We're going to stay these understudies. To industrialize this threatens our jobs. Whereas in America, it was embraced. So the success of industrialization, not farmers, provided a huge incentive to increase the speed of delivery and to bring that price of the cost of moving goods around down. And again, we see that yet today, don't we? Whereas individuals, all of which may need these jobs or these items or something from the government, well, they're just individuals. But when a business and a multitude of businesses come together, government seems to listen. As I said, the Erie Canal was a major undertaking. It's only affordable with government support. Known as Clinton's folly, it was no folly at all. And it will pave the way, because remember, that's how the railroads are going to get built. That's how all the rest of these are going to get built, with major funding from, support funding from the government. And that's going to result in improved transportation, in rail and canals. Canals are everywhere after the success of the Erie Canal. Most of them, none of them even close to that length. But all of these things together with the steamboats will provide improved communication. Improved communication means ideas can be transmitted. And with the transmittal of ideas comes the improvement of income. And that's a big deal. And this is broadcast to the world by, a young Frenchman who is in America, who's watching all this. And he would write back, but the rivers and steamboats have annihilated space and time. Yeah, he was just visiting America, and you can't say he was wrong. Remember, prior to this, what do I always say? No one moved faster than the speed of a single horse. And now all of a sudden you have a sustained ability to go much faster than that. You're annihilating space and time. Now, as I said, those pivotal moments, War of 1812 taught the Republicans then, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, who were not first line Jeffersonians the way James Madison had been, but the three of them would come to realize there are hefty consequences to being a Jeffersonian Republican idealist, because that's really what Jefferson was. He was saying, well, this is what it could be if all of us were agrarians, a great agrarian nation. And we're not. We're going to have, we have more than that. We have industrialization now. By the way, that second picture that came up is John C. Calhoun, powerhouse in the South, just as Henry Clay is more of a powerhouse to the middle section of the country, and then well known because of his work in the in Congress. Together, they quickly realized that, we should have a new system. We should call, and this is really Clay's work. They create the idea of an American system, a whole new set of powers that were previously unknown in the Constitution, under that part of necessary, the necessary things that must be done. And that includes transportation. And they will become in Congress Madison's key men for getting his final agenda through, which will include a lot of those things. But outside the Northeast, most people do not want government investing in these things. Why? Because the South does not see a need in it. The South has no need for education for their workers. The South has no need for all of these great roads. They've got the one road from their plantation to the dock. What do they care? Remember, I'd mentioned the cotton gin, which allowed 10 times the amount of cotton to be produced, which meant that the South needed 10 times the amount of cotton to be picked, which required more workers, which in reality meant more slaves. And the South thus, which was not true in the Revolutionary period, the South grows far more committed to slavery than they had been originally. Remember, there was that recognition that during the Revolution, slavery was probably going to have to die out. First of all, the North was trying to imprison the South into, no, it's only existing in the places it's at. We, on the other hand, in the North are getting rid of it, which they were. And then they were also saying, you can't bring them to our states. We've written into our constitutions that if an enslaved man is on our soil, and depending on which state, for a week, a month, a quarter, possibly a year, they were now a free man. They now lived here, and our state is a free soil state. And that's true of much of the North, including the new state of Iowa. And this will become an important point because that has, as the North is trying to say this is wrong and we need to do away with it. And it's wrong also because it threatens the livelihoods of the workers in the North, right? If somebody could take a group of slaves and go to Connecticut and set up a mill where they're going to be producing, thread and yarn and everything else, suddenly what happens to those workers that are up there? They will be competing with slave labor. Something not to be overlooked in what happens with us in the free market across the world. We're not competing, our goods are not being judged against goods that are being created necessarily by people who are free to do the work. They might be slaves, right? But here's the thing, in that time, remember, the founding fathers had made the agreement with the Constitution that no bill could be put into play that would reduce or terminate the importation of new slaves for 10 years. And it was at the end of Jefferson's presidency, his last year, that he said, I noticed that this is that anniversary for 10 years. And if the House and Senate were to send me such a bill, I would sign that. We would outlaw the importation of new slaves. And what that actually does is it sends a message to those slave states that if we are ever outnumbered by the free states, slavery would be at risk. And they were right. In fact, though, and this was the issue that got Jefferson to write that terribly negative paragraph. When we reach 1919, or excuse me, 1819, and Missouri applies to come into the Union, very quietly, James Talmage will attach a rider to it that says, and provided that further induction of slavery or involuntary servitude will be prohibited, and that all children born within the said state after the admission thereof to the Union shall be free at the age of 25 years. It's a verbal bombshell on this era where everybody's striving to get along. It's early February of 1819. And Talmage was the guy who had helped push New York to get rid of slavery, and that spread to other states. It is that moment in time when the South realizes they are outnumbered and they are outgunned when it comes to this issue. And if they ever allow there to be more northern states than southern states, i.e. more non-slavery states than southern slave states, they will be winked out of existence. And you can see that they're not wrong. The Northwest Ordinance, which brought in the Michigan area and all of that there shall be no slaves in these areas. Of course, the Northwest Ordinance is also the one that said states should provide for education. Those are all things the South does not want to do. And then that ban on the importation of slaves that we just spoke of. The Southern need for balance in Congress becomes very, very apparent, and they are, in their minds, fighting for their lives. Now, what Talmage was doing was a sincere and simple way to help work toward a gradual emancipation that the Revolutionary era folks had believed would come to pass, because they all knew that the ground for cotton and the ground for tobacco, if you just kept working it, is going to become less and less fertile. And with that, what will be the need of the slavery people? And the issue with that also, realize everybody makes a big deal about the fact that here's Jefferson, who's always in debt. Well, one of the reasons Jefferson is always in debt is because he has over 200 slaves. So he's rich on the books. You know, these slaves are each worth a certain amount of money. But Jefferson, like Washington, like many of the others, realized that these, and forgive me, I'm going to reach for words that aren't going to work well or sound right, but Jefferson and Washington understood that it was their job to care for these slaves. Now, part of that's economic. You have this investment, you want to take care of it, but that also meant, realize when they got old, you're still going to house them, you're still going to feed them. When they're too young to do any labor that's worthwhile, you're still going to house them and feed them. Jefferson had not embraced the idea. He was at that era prior to 1915 or 1815, 1820, where the growth of new slaves became important. In other words, in the term of animal husbandry, shall we say, his whole point was it cost him money to have these slaves, and he was always indebted up to his eyebrows for all of the fine additions he was trying to always constantly do in Monticello. So with all that, you know, he was at that point where he could see, as many of the Revolutionary era slave owners could see, there was a reason why the slave trade needed to go away, and there's a reason why slavery needed to go away. But as the South had grown more committed to slavery, you know, than in the Revolutionary era, Now they saw that slaves have a cash value, and if you just are selling them with no concern for families or anything else, they are an asset and a cash asset. But to really be that way, the Southerners need new outlets and places to sell them. And that coincides as well with the idea of not being hemmed in and falling behind on the number of states. So also realize through all this time, not one person gets up in Congress and defends slavery or the act of slavery. Many of these people are religious, and while the Bible might mention slaves, it does not it does not, you know, remove the issue from the slave owner. So we don't defend slavery. The issue is always about the constitutionality. What does the law allow? And I think we can all realize we have those same arguments today about issues, do we not? We don't talk about, everybody knows that the result is bad. The question is, what's the law? Well, the law says we have the right to do this, ergo it must be okay. We'll realize just as then when this attack, because that's how the South perceives it, when this attack on the South and their livelihood and their peculiar institution is recognized, when Congress returns in December, and by the way, I know you've all forgotten this, but Congress used to adjourn. We don't do that anymore. And that's the subject of an entirely different talk. But, Congress used to adjourn. And when they returned in December, the speeches are, as Thomas Cobb would say, interminable as well as inflammatory. And he himself would say to the south, to the north, you have kindled a fire which all the waters in the ocean cannot put out, which seas of blood can only extinguish. Saying we will never give up our slaves. We will never give up our peculiar institution. And what follows and will play out for the next 4 decades is that the South's most effective threat is that they will destroy the Union. They will leave it, rip it to shreds if we don't get our way. And that becomes their most effective and most powerful method of getting what they want. And they're not wrong. In the case of Missouri, who's trying to come in as a slave state, finally, to get this resolved, Henry Clay, the person who is one of the most incredible deal makers in American history, will go to President Monroe and decide this issue has to end. And they realize they cannot push the South to end it. They push the North to then provide a way, an opportunity by maintaining the balance of states. And they do that by saying the country's going to be destroyed, and leans on Massachusetts, the home of the Adams, to say, you have the additional space to the North to avoid this threat of disunion. Go ahead and separate, allow your area to the north to separate, and then it can apply for statehood as the District of Maine. And in doing so, they make it happen promptly with Clay to oversee it. Senate leadership promptly links the 2 states together. In other words, Maine cannot become a state unless Missouri becomes a state without the Talmadge Amendment. So the 2 of them, are forcing the issue to say, we want the Talmadge Amendment that says you can't have slaves in this area removed. And what they do is get a compromise on that the rest of the Louisiana Purchase lying north of 3630, which is the southern border of Missouri, that any of those north of there cannot come in as slave states. And that allows just enough people to say, okay, but the while the anti-slavery congressmen are still upset, 18 will come around to say, well, to save the Union, we have to do this. And they will vote to allow Missouri in. And as a group, they will pay the price the next election. And I can't remember, out of the 18, I am thinking 14 will lose their jobs to their northern competitors because they voted to allow slavery in Missouri. And what that means is everybody says, oh, we've done this except Missouri itself. And Missouri refuses to play along, refuses to go along with the idea that they're going to eventually free their slaves. And they will create, and they revamp their constitution, protecting slavery into the future. And thus the deal is going to be off. And the agreement, all the compromises are failing. But it's Clay who will pull together an agreement, break all the choices into three parts, get them passed, slide them into the Senate under the nose of the people trying to stop that, and makes it happen. It wasn't easy, and it's only going to get harder. And what you've just seen will be replayed at least 3 more times in the next 4 decades. Meaning the result, at the time it said the crisis was averted, the Missouri Compromise has been created. We now know that nothing north of this can come in as a slave state, et cetera, et cetera. No, the crisis was not averted. It is simply postponed. But remember that while all this is happening, from 1816 on, all those Western states, especially in the North, are moving to allow voting by people who are not property owners. They need people to come into their state. You've got to have the workers. You've got to have the people improving the land. You've got to have the markets and the marketplaces. And thus these Western states, and it will continue that way for the rest of our lives as these states come in, start saying, oh, well, in our state, you don't have to be a property owner to vote. You don't have to be one of the upper class. You are able to vote as long as, well, you do have to be male. And of course, you can't be black. But white males are being granted the vote in Indiana, and that will spread further and further, rippling its way back toward the east. Remember, and we never talk about this, we forget the Constitution only had the ability to vote for whom? You really only directly voted for your representative. That's the only people you voted for. Voting is decided at the state level. If that state is a member of the Union, you are a member of the United States. But almost everybody you vote for, with the exception of your congressman, it's all a state vote. It's your county, it's your state, it's your locality. There's nobody you're casting a vote for other than your representative and maybe the electors. You vote for the president, but that's really just a beauty contest. Most times the electors will endorse the person who gets the most votes in their state, but who knows who that is. So, but remember, this is also a draw to everybody across the water in Europe, because hard times are taking place in Europe. There are famines, there are lands and farms failing due to overwork because they never rotate the crops. And as the owners are trying desperately to increase the money from it, they often get rid of the people who are working it to put new people in rather than these people they're having problems with. Also, of course, you have revolutions. You have things happening which are promoting the idea of these governments getting rid of people and pushing them out. And America, with the Tocqueville and all the magazines and the newspapers and everything else talking about this place where no class exists, again, as long as you are not black, There's no class. Everybody has equal opportunity. Anyone could become rich. Doesn't this sound like our lottery commercials today? Oh, anybody can do this. But there is more chance than Europe ever had, right? But what happens is this is pulling immigration across the Atlantic into America. And you can see the 1.3 is from 1820 to 1830, but all of a sudden, starting from 1830 on, it just escalates for the next 100 years, doesn't it? And it's very, very high. And a lot of this is due to the European fascination with that experiment of the Republic, or the experiment in self-government. Unlike Europe, they can see that you have a freedom of movement between your social classes. You know, if you make enough money, you can move into the next social class up. And yet, we know, as I said, it's much like our lotteries. In truth, in America at that time, most rich people were born rich. Very few worked their way into it. And of course, as we know, not everyone could work their way into wealth. Now, at the same time, as I said, Monroe, the last president of the Revolutionary era, is also the last one to get the unified Republican caucus, the congressional caucus, to say, this is the person we should put up for president. And part of that's because Henry Clay is running, and Henry Clay wants to run. And, you know, he, of course, is of Congress. So now you have that local boy, and it makes it very hard for somebody to, you know, say, well, I don't really like this guy. We want to go to somebody else. But of course, he's still a power in Congress. At the same time, the traditional path to the presidency is either through the Secretary of State position or through the vice presidency. And, you know, John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, has been in government his entire life, from the time of the Revolution as a teenager, where he will go and visit the foreign capitals as Washington's emissary. He has worked his way all the way up. He expects to be anointed as the next president. But he too does not get that unified caucus to choose him. And in doing so, they have splintered the vote. And at the same time, here's Andrew Jackson, who is a hero among the popular people, not necessarily the landed aristocracy. But remember what's happened? All of these states have started expanding who can vote. So now we have the person that the caucus does choose, William Crawford, who's a very weak candidate, and all of these others all vying for the same position. And because the caucus chose somebody so weak, it allowed both Clay and Adams to get into the race. But in doing so, they're able to justify it, saying, well, you know that we have to get in, because otherwise this barbarian from across the mountains, Andrew Jackson, who when he was in the military for Monroe, ignored Monroe's orders and would do whatever the heck he wanted and call it good. You know, caused a scene with Spain, caused, you know, summarily shot some people in Spanish holdings down in Florida. How can that be? At the same time, the South is feeling unfairly and unequally treated, but in the North, just the opposite feeling exists. In the North, they look at the southern states with very few white population in it, who are ruling the Union in their estimation, because they don't have the population, but they get the 3/5 clause vote for all of the slaves they have, which gives them equality on that level. And of course, they have equality due to Franklin's idea that every state has 2 votes in the Senate. At the same time, while you've got all of these people coming in that are new to America, we also have that yet again increase in the newspapers, the pamphlets, the handouts. And what we see are blasts against General Jackson, or, Jackson forever, the man of the people. And the statement would be, it's constantly about the people, the people, the people. And he himself addresses that it's not the man on horseback to be feared, but the corruptors that have taken control of the seats of government. These people who just vote themselves in, do what they want. This isn't sounding at all familiar, is it? And then realize what happens. We get to the election, and in that election, Jackson does win the popular vote because the three men split it. John Quincy Adams came in at 31%, Jackson 43%, so he's less than a majority, but he's also, unfortunately for him, less than a majority in the Electoral College. And if you have less than a majority in the Electoral College, where does it get sent to? It gets sent to the House of Representatives, right? And with that loss in the Electoral College, and then the follow-up issue of how is the House going to vote? Well, let's remember the House is Henry Clay's house. He has a great deal of swing, although very few would be so bold as just to vote strictly for Henry Clay. But maybe he can do something else. But it's Jackson's loss of the Electoral College that's going to move electors from being appointed to elected as well in a vote. So when we end up with this being thrown to the House, no one still gets a majority. Remember the way it works there. If you have 9 House representatives for your state, they will caucus as a state, and however they vote, whoever gets a majority, they get that state. And it's by the number of states that will decide who is the next president. And Clay will eventually throw his weight to Adams in the House, and Adams turns around and makes Clay Secretary of State. And this is a shocking event to a lot of the people who had supported Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, of course, is calling it the unholy alliance. Andrew Jackson is calling it, an evil thing and showing the corruption that exists. And yet Andrew Jackson will not be president, but he will spend 4 years inveighing against these people. But you have to remember as well, though, even with Clay's support, Adams only wins, only gets 13 states. So I think it's something like 13-9 or something like that. He does not have an overwhelming majority, and everybody knows it. And he, and especially Congress says, no, we're going to do what we want. And thus, with all that, you end up with an election in 1824 that Clay probably engineered that undid his efforts as much as Adams' presidency. Clay, who's probably one of the most gifted deal makers and visionary people of his era, will never attain the presidency, though he tries many times. He will continue to be a power either in the House or the Senate, depending on which one he's in. And of course, for the next 4 years, he's Secretary of State, trying to follow that path that says, oh, you are worthy to be president. Jackson will simply dismiss him and say he too will meet the same fate as John Quincy Adams. because Jackson's fury about the corrupt bargain never relents, and he never fails to bring it forward. But before we think too much about that, we need to realize all of these people brought this on themselves. For these Republican leaders, this was a party not dedicated to any political principle. The eternal differences were limited to what you spend and how much you spend on the infrastructure. All of them, all of those of those three, really felt much the same way about things. It was just a little bit the nuance of how much. Yet on the other side, it too is not about a political concept. The Jacksonians, a totally new group, they're a loose coalition of lots of different people with lots of different concerns. They are only dedicated to one thing: the general. Not any party, not any set of ideals. It's just whatever this guy says, we're backing him. Now, there are political differences. We need to realize this. The concept of a national bank is still something that Clay and John Quincy Adams recognize as a necessary tool to have a healthy government. They are also well aware that regionalism exists and that somehow that has to be overcome to be able to progress forward. Thus, they are interested in that. They still believe in that concept of improving transportation, because improving transportation improves the give and take between these regional areas as well. And the idea that education should not be just a state concern, but a concern for the nation. So in other words, like Hamilton and Jefferson, their real disagreement is just about, what the government can and cannot do. It's not, it's not totally opposites between all these folks that are on that side. But the differences between them and Jackson is, to the people outside, it's just about whether or not you accept Andrew Jackson as the powerful person that he is. They have pledged their support to the man, not anything that he did. And whatever he says he stands for is what they stand for. And of course, he follows that with, I have great confidence in the virtue of the great majority of people, and I cannot fear the result. Well, unlike Adams Sr., John Adams Sr., and Ben Franklin, of course, no one ever threatened to tear Andrew Jackson's house down. If they had, he would have stood out front and shot them. And to that point, remember that media is capitalizing on this star that they have in Andrew Jackson, and the concept that he is 100% behind the common man, and thus showing, really Jackson as president, will hang Adams. And, if he gets him. So kind of like, well, if I get to be president, we'll lock him up, right? We have seen some of these things. It looks familiar. As I said, that's General Andrew Jackson hoisting up the president, John Quincy Adams. Now, another thing that looks awfully familiar to us as they come up on their rematch 4 years later, Jackson has worked awfully hard to make sure that his people are elected into the state houses. And much of that is done then by expanding the suffrage during those 4 years, even in those states that hadn't expanded it before, to say, no, we want the common man. The common man deserves this, not just people with land. And thus, Jacksonians in the state legislatures ensured that 1824 would not happen again. Does that sound familiar to any of you? We've seen some of the same things being promoted today. I remember Jackson's inauguration, the first president who did not come from an East Coast elite. His victory is seen as a triumph for the common man and, of course, for democracy. And that's the way it's explained to all of us. And we all remember from junior high, from grade school, being told about, the inaugural parties where everyone would just show up and they not only took the food, but they took home the plates, the silverware. They tore down the wallpaper and the blinds and the window treatments. It's much is made of such a scene of confusion took place as it's impossible to describe, because of course they were all of the people. They're the common man, and thus this is our house as well. And they took a piece of it home with them. Now, by the same token, that's what was presented to us in our history books. We do need to think about, remember, this is a case where the outsider took control. Maybe not all is quite as radical, boisterous as we were told. Now, to his, to the people in government, Jackson's thought to be illiterate and a hothead. Well, they're right on the hothead. And he isn't somebody who spends his time sitting around reading, but he is not illiterate. He surprises many people by taking more moderate stands on some issues. And he also instigates the investigations into spending that he had talked about. So, on some things, he's actually quite understanding. But remember, he will never, ever be a fan of banks, and he is going to do battle with the banks. But more than that, he has a radical idea that there needs, and he sells it as rotation in office. Remember, it's all of these people that are in office for so long and they're just putting themselves back in. His plan is to sweep clean the corruption from the offices, which means he's going to remove all the people from office that were not elected to the office, that are appointed. And what that really means is he's just going to get them out of there so he can put his people in there. It's rotation in office. He claims it gets out the corruption, yet the other side sees it for what it is, which is, hey, to the victor goes the spoils. He needs to be able to put his people in, and he gets away with it. Now, one of the things that will happen, of course, Clay is going to be back in either the House or Senate, depending on which one he wants to get elected to that year. And Clay and Daniel Webster and others who have seen the things that Jackson does, because one of the reasons they might think he's illiterate is because they are positive for some of the things this guy does. He could not possibly have read the Constitution. And the only reason you wouldn't read the Constitution is if you can't read. Well, that's not quite accurate. He just isn't going to be bothered by it. He's going to do what he thinks is best. They, of course, are going to work to distract him, to try to pass laws that need to be passed, to bind him, do things that will stop him from destroying the country. And what they couldn't count on was the fact that Jackson has an incredible ability to communicate with and unite the two groups that, are not just the common man groups. These are the ones that have always distrusted all soft money, and those who have liked banks, but they really don't want a national bank. They want a local bank. Why? Because, of course, the local bank means they can control it. They might make the profits on it. And in doing so, he confounds Clay and Webster, who will pass laws that will draw his veto. And they're going, now you're embarrassed with your people. And he's not. He continues. His communications will keep them with him no matter what. And he then goes further. When he realizes the bank is completely against him, he does the easiest thing in the world from his point of view. You can remove the federal funds from the bank, put it into local banks. Well, that's not legal. It's legal if I say it is Jackson's comeback. Now, he had to fire his Treasury Secretary to do it, but he would not be stopped. Again, haven't we seen something like this? You know, if the issue was the constitutional right to create a bank and give it powers, then what difference did local or national make? That difference is about who gets the money, who is into it. And of course, Jackson's statement is he's against the elites, and it's all the elites that have bought into the bank. And there is some aspects that he is not wrong on that. On the other hand, there are other aspects that he is not getting rid of corruption. He's simply spreading corruption to different people, spreading the opportunity for corruption. So, as all this is going on, and Jackson will be returned in a re-election campaign, and Jackson will anoint a successor in Martin Van Buren. And, he will have through Martin Van Buren then, a 12-year run of the things that he has believed. But Martin Van Buren is no Andrew Jackson. The outrageous things, the things that go against the way things should be, the laws, the Constitution won't happen. But in this same time period, we have the rise of the reformers. And again, part of this is the ability to connect by letter, by mail, more importantly, by newspaper or broadside. And it coincides with the rise, which is cyclic in America, the rise of religion. And that is coming back as well. We're defining a balance of power, and Jacksonians will gather around these reformers, for the things that match their local interests. But at the same time, there's another whole group. The anti-slavery groups are, the abolitionists are gaining power. And of course, Jackson is no abolitionist. So the reform, you've got the abolitionists coming forward, and they're posing slavery as a moral wrong, versus the evil that is happening in the South. You've got the Temperance Union, which, is against excessive consumption of alcohol, which is widespread. But that really has been due to the rise in manufacturing, the rise in people working in jobs, the people being injured in those jobs. It's not like you're at home working on the farm, you're working in a major business. And if you don't come home because you're injured or die, it's your wife and children that are suffering. And this is at the same time that the women's rights movement is moving forward, under Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott. Those people are pushing that forward. And also the idea of education for all, creating intelligent voters who will support and perpetuate democracy. The idea being a free public education supported by tax dollars. And as I said, all of these wrap up with religion. Many of these issues are due to that, that belief as religion grows. And it's this period of time when we're starting to see the Calvinists, the Methodists, and these follow-up Protestant groups that are coming through. And these are all people, whose parents had experienced social scorn by religious groups in their native lands or by Puritans once they got here. They're creating a new form of religion that matches their needs. It's why we get these new religious groups. Jackson is not done yet. His time has not ended there. But one of the problems is there's always been the question from the time of the creation of the Constitution, who is it that needs to be restrained? Is it the government or the people? And we saw the fact that the original founding fathers clearly understood that government had to have checks and balances, had to have a way to prevent government from becoming so powerful. And of course, that was the Bill of Rights, to ensure that things stayed in that level. But by the same side, they are also well aware that it is the people that drives the government to do things that enrich the people if they're with that group. One group's tyranny over another, the tyranny of the majority over the minority. And we see that clearly toward the end of Jackson's time, in which the problem of majority rule on his decisions of removal of Indians. Of course, all of the white people around those areas in the South, which had been promised by treaty, either with Washington, Adams, Jefferson, that had been promised to be able to remain on their land. Now, of course, there are issues where all the white groups around them, even though in many cases those Indians had taken on a white persona. They dressed like the people of their area. They had jobs and created towns like people of the area. But when the majority white populations around them wanted them removed, and there's more than 45,000 of them that will be, and much of that is due to the fact that Jackson never, ever liked Native Americans. They were the enemy. He fought them on the field and would never change that concept. So his feeling of the majority over the minority was perfectly all right, although enshrined in the concept of majority rule is the fact you can rule, but the majority cannot choose to hang the minority. And yet that will be an issue constantly with Native Americans and Black people, right? And that will reappear again as Jackson will appoint to the Supreme Court the man who had been one of his chief people in his cabinet, possibly kitchen cabinet, of Roger Taney. And Taney is the man who will later deny Dred Scott's humanity in favor of the public's property rights. Remember, Dred Scott was that case of where Dred Scott had gone with his master, which always seems nicer to say than owner, I guess, up to Minnesota, lived up there over a year. Minnesota, of course, was a free state. Minnesota, and Dred Scott did not necessarily push for it at the time. He came back later, and it wasn't until, because he liked his owner, he got along with him, he was his helper, his aide, had been with him a long time. It's not until he is later, after the owner's demise, is given to the owner's sister, who would then give it to yet another person, that Dred Scott finally is going, I should be free. And we need to remember here that this is an important issue, just in the fact that if you think about property rights in America, it's always about that is the biggest issue that the legal system deals with. And in doing so, with the Dred Scott issue, this concept with Taney's ruling is not only for the majority over the minority, but also for ownership rights, as though these were not people, but property. And it's the will of the people that Jackson is saying he's doing. Now, Jackson will change this country. He changes the presidency, and we cannot overlook how drastically he does so. On the good side, his election breaks the norm of elites trading offices among themselves. He also, to the good, he proved to the South they could not have their way under threat of leaving the Union, because he's the one who stood up to Calhoun, saying you can't nullify laws, and if you do, we're going to, I will bring the army south and prove it to you. He's seen as increasing the rights of the common man. Yet, how common is Andrew Jackson? He was a very intelligent man, but more important, though, on the negative side, he moves power into the hands of the presidency at a greater rate than all the presidents before him. And he does so by appealing to the public, and the public who likes him says no problem. Even though the Supreme Court, said you cannot break these treaties and remove these natives, Jackson is said to quip, well, I know the size of the army I have that will be removing these natives. I will be very curious to see the size of the army that the Supreme Court has. And of course, it's at that point that, the Supreme Court will try one more time, but proves ineffectual, even though they are upholding legalities, laws, treaties that had been written, and will oversee those, will be forced to sit back and see those 45,000 Native Americans forced to move, and in the process, how many thousands die. It's wrong. And if you wanted to, you could have said, Jackson should be impeached, but if you're popular, what are your chances of an impeachment happening? We've never seen that happen as well, right? We have to remember what this does then is the political leaders lose control of the situation. What is politics? Politics is the concept that we're going to represent our people and make the best possible deal that serves both or multiple groups. And instead, if those political leaders lose control, then you now just have somebody who decides, such as Jackson, well, this is what I'm doing, let's see you stop me. You have lost that concept of government by the people, have you not? And what happens in that case? Callahan, who is completely diminished by Jackson's swat down of him in that nullification item, becomes more completely focused on the South and in deep down on moving the South. Once Jackson is gone, once all of this is gone, moving the South away from the Union. Southern Whigs are completely marginalized. Those people that should be supporting things that Northerners like, they have no standing in the South. They cannot even get votes. They are dismissed and despised, and thus cannot do anything. They don't exist. Northern Whigs, on the other hand, don't like immigrants, and thus they lose strength as well because they can't get the votes of the common man, because they can't find any commonality with those immigrants. In many ways, this should perhaps be called the concept of giving people what they want and what the problem with that is. Think of the things we saw. It was an increasing population, much of it largely an immigrant population. Thus, we are undercutting that idea of people who have a common bond around this government. These are people who have just moved in. They don't even know what that government is, and there is no education process necessarily to tell them. We saw a time of increasing information being shared, and that should be a good thing. But at the same time, we see a drastic increase in disinformation, people telling you their side, which may not be factual, but it supports their side of the argument. Now, we saw honest differences of opinion, but the more important point was the lack of any respect for the opinion of others. Only my opinion counts because my opinion is my opinion, and that is what counts. Yours doesn't. There is no concept of compromise. There is no concept of putting those things together. Yet we saw the idea of the South breaking away completely stymied and stomped by Jackson, by that more powerful ruler. So there is, a give and take here, that there was something to be said for the fact that he had enough strength to stop that. Now, realize over the next few years, the biggest unsettling pieces will happen in the fact that by showing how much power a president can have, despite the fact that both Congress and the Supreme Court, the two checks and balances, right, are against him, what happens is Congress tries to reassert itself and does so in the early 1840s. But then a dark horse candidate that nobody really knew, but who was an acolyte of Jackson's, by the name of Polk, will get himself elected, utilizing the call to the common man, utilizing his connection to Jackson, utilizing all of these things that Jackson had utilized, and gets himself elected. And in doing so, then basically will push for a war that will bring the United States into war with Mexico, and in doing so will bring the New Mexico territory and the Utah territory and all of California into American hands, just in time, of course, for the gold rush in California. So by 1850, Polk will have completely changed the map of America, and will have done so over the objections. As a young representative from Illinois would say, show me the square foot of American soil where those troopers were standing, on that fight, the ambush that is ballyhooed to start the battle with Mexico. Show me, where that happened on American soil, because it didn't. There was an argument as to whether it was the Rio Grande or the other river there, and the Americans had been posted, across that into what was truly Mexico's territory. But he escaped all penalties because he was doing what the common man wanted, taking more land, taking more property. But in the process, bringing in Texas and all this territory will end up just giving that regionalism or sectionalism more ground and more problems to foster. And yet another ambitious man, Stephen Douglas, who wants to become president, comes up with the idea of how he can use slavery to, and thus ending the problems with slavery, to become president. He's got the idea where he'll push forward a plan where each state gets what they want, by deciding what they want, and who could dispute that. Allow the territories to decide for himself. He introduces the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is designed to neutralize the slavery issue. Of course, what it does is it sets it on fire. It supersedes the Compromise of 1850. As I said, yet another compromise to try to avoid the conflicts of the free versus slave states coming in. But eventually, his process will also invalidate the Missouri Compromise, and that opens all the territories to slavery, which the North cannot abide by. At that point, what happens if you move up, 25 workers and create a textile mill in Connecticut? Well, you don't have to pay those items that I have to pay, and now it's unfair competition, right? So he gets his way. He gets the Kansas-Nebraska Act, destroying the Missouri Compromise, and he creates Bleeding Kansas at the same time, because it worked for the person whose name you can't even remember as president. Even though we drive up and down Pierce Street in Sioux City all the time, right? Kansas has a majority of free soil settlers, but those Missourians that are adjacent to it are not going to accept that, and they will send war parties into Kansas to destroy and burn out anybody that's supporting a free soil outcome for Kansas. And what will happen is that, they essentially use fraud to take over. And when an anti-slavery alternative capital is created in Lawrence, they would raid it, burn it, and kill people. These fights over the expansion of slavery to the territories become the key issue that will be dealt with throughout the 1850s and will give rise to an entirely new party, because the Whigs are totally useless on this issue. They cannot change anything. And with that, they are diminished as a party that can possibly do anything. Now, those new Republicans, of course, will not be able to avoid coming into conflict with Southerners. And it is Charles Sumner who will be beaten with a cane on the floor of the Senate by a Southerner, a Southerner from the House, but the man is expelled, and South Carolina voters will return him immediately to the House. Sumner will remain senator for Massachusetts for years, but rarely, if at all, and only toward the end of his life, will he come back to the Senate. So again, that warfare and intimidation that is the hallmark of this. The Whigs, who had replaced the Federalists, are now finding themselves totally unable to deal with the issues. And again, we have a case where the party cannot resolve problems. They lose authority, and in becoming desperate to win, they will split the vote, only making it worse. So, and even if they do win, it's with a minority backing, and things go away. And again, now you need another issue, and that next issue, of course, will be the concept of, the Fugitive Slave Act, which will say that northern states that say that if you step foot on those northern states, you're free. Not anymore. Which side wasn't believed in states' rights? But it's the South that's demanding that northern states have to pay to bring back these slaves. This fugitive slave law and the religious great renewal, just doesn't work together. The religious folks are outraged, and abolition, which is one of those items that has grown up, now has found its issue and its promoter. It comes to the woman in a dream. Her name is Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she will write the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin and the terrible wrongs that are done to those black slaves, and it will sell millions. It'll sell 8 million over 7 years, 300,000 the first year. And years later, when she ends up visiting the White House and Abraham Lincoln is now the president and there's a war going on, his line to her is, "So you're the little lady who wrote the book that caused this big war," because it radicalized many Northerners already opposed to that concept. So as we wrap this up, the big thing we need to realize, those abolitionist forces, outraged about both Uncle Tom's Cabin and Bleeding Kansas, are looking for a new voice. They find it in the Republican Party. But, at this point, a man who again wants to become president will turn to the Supreme Court and say, "This is your chance put away this issue of slavery, get rid of it forever by proving how it works. And in doing so, the Supreme Court manipulates its own agenda and will hold out for a report, a finding that says not only is Dred Scott still the property of a white man, it will find that the white man has no obligation to any black man. Quote, the black man has no rights that whites are obligated to observe. And he goes even further. He finds the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, a 40-year-old law thrown out, snap, like that. We've never seen anything like that happen, have we? 50-year-old law? Yeah. In the ruling by the Supreme Court, he sees absolutely no limits to slavery. And thus, in doing so, the verdict will crystallize the attitudes that lead to the war. And that is what comes of ambition and erroneous choices, and the idea that presidents have the power to even make deals with the Supreme Court to find these, because we find in Buchanan's letters and papers influence on the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision. He convinced one of the justices to withdraw his limited denial to allow Taney to make that sweeping claim about no whites have any obligation to reserve any rights of a black man. Buchanan's efforts fail miserably. It backfires, it strengthens the opposition, and it will sweep in, some man named Abraham Lincoln. And mainly because the North just cannot support this new reading of the Constitution. And by doing so, it will bring in a war in which 620,000 soldiers will die. Now, that's the numbers that they have always used. More lately, recent papers argue that it's likely close to 750,000 soldiers, which that means it's more than all, very close, if not more than every war other than the War of Rebellion. Every death that was created in all those other wars are exceeded by the deaths in the War of Rebellion. So again, the problem with giving people what they want, and what things did we see? An increasing population due to immigration, mostly increasing information, but an outsized amount of disinformation, differences in opinion, but as we saw even by the Supreme Court, a total lack of respect for the opinion of others. That really, in a nutshell, a very large nutshell, should explain how we ended up, even though I didn't go step by step through the 1950s, we see how it ends up that so many people will die in that terrible, terrible war, because every step of the way we ignore the concept that people have rights. It's only the people with the power that have rights. At least that's what Andrew Jackson taught us. So if you look at it, do you see those moments where, a president just decides this is what, I'm able to do? This is what we actually are going to do? He did not care about the laws or rules. He just did what he wanted, right? So I would love it if you'd unmute yourself. We are at the end of the night. I actually went a few minutes over, but I'm open for questions. I will say that in the message chat, I do see how much of Jefferson's debt was because he was a farmer. His debt was because he was a farmer of about half his land that was not that good. The other part being that the guy never saw a book that he wouldn't buy. And lastly, the biggest issue, that he was constantly improving and renovating the Monticello. Now, that said, there's also the problem that the federal government was in arrears to pay him what he was owed during his time when he was minister to France, and yet he was still buying books back and forth all the time. He was in France and everything else. So he was not a good steward of his own money. That's the biggest point. Secondly, he had more slaves than he should have had, but of course, you measured wealth back then by how many slaves you had. He had inherited most of his, both from his side of the family and from his wife's family. So now, as I hope you can see, there's an awful lot of issues here that do look awfully familiar.
Thank you, Russ.
Yeah, you bet. Good to see you. Anybody else? Questions, thoughts? Just unmute yourselves and feel free to talk.
Well, the big problem was that nobody wanted to do anything about slavery.
Yeah, and that really is the issue, isn't it? It was that issue they could not find an answer for. And that too is another issue that we see here yet today, although in our case, and in both cases, there is that issue that the people who feel something should be done felt passionate about it because of the lives involved. And, there is an aspect of that on the abortion side of issues here today. You cannot be, if you look at this, it's hard to be dispassionate, at least in the face of what you're told. But again, that becomes the question of what information are you accessing? What are you actually being told versus what is real as well? So anybody, was this a worthwhile use of your time tonight?
Oh, yes.
I did not want to, we've gone over the actual final steps that get into the Civil War in a number of classes. I kind of wanted to make the 1950s as brief as, or the 1850s as brief as possible because of that. And mainly because, as you just said, Joan, the real issue is back here with slavery, isn't it? And we just keep pushing that issue on down the road. And a lot of that is also because since we would not recognize them as people, and because the South had treated them as less than people for so long, we're going to see going forward that issue, later is the same one they have now, which is, well, even saying we got rid of slavery, what do we do? Even Thomas Jefferson questioned whether whites and blacks could live together in close proximity. And of course, part of that is the issue that what did you see in those Indian nations in the South? Could they live together? And what will we see in 1920 with burning out Tulsa and a number of other successful black enclaves where people had forced them to live on their own, and then they do so and are capable of it and doing very well. So of course the white community comes up and destroys those black communities, in that 1919, 1920 era of doing that. And we're going to see that in an upcoming class. There is that question of, again, people will not wrestle with the tough questions of what really should be looked at, but we refuse to because one side or the other refuses to compromise on the issue. So big issues.
Well, and you really can't I don't know, compromising on slavery. Either you're free or you're not.
Mhm.
I
But
suppose,
I mean, what are you going to decide won't compromise on whether we can live next to them?
yeah.
You know, that's what I was saying. That was the part I was saying, is that, hey, we couldn't even agree. All right, even if we were to say they can be free, where? You know, and that monopolizes a lot of this. They cannot, they could not divorce themselves enough of their prejudice to truly come up with any kind of reasonable answer of saying, well, maybe you ought to get to know these people and find out they're really people. You know,
Well,
so
or even let them go to school, let them,
yeah, exactly.
uh,
And why
let
is
them
the South?
try on clothes in a department store, drink from the same drinking fountain.
Yeah. Well, think about this. Why is the South so opposed to public education for so many years?
Oh, because black people would get it.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you run into the same thing with helping welfare moms go to college. They're okay with it as long as it's white women, but if a black woman is able to do it too, then all of a sudden we don't want it, and so nobody gets it.
Very possible. That's outside my wheelhouse, and I'm gonna go right on past that one for tonight. I am keeping you late, but seriously, if any of you have thoughts, questions, ideas, I value when you ask the questions, and I appreciate your input. And you know, these are weighty issues, and we have not escaped them yet. And that's one of the things we're going to see throughout the course of this. How many of the issues, if we don't deal with them at the time, they will need to be dealt with in the future, and some of them just keep on rolling into the future, don't they? But do you see some of the issues that we identified? Maybe not all of them, but some of them may come up again in future talks on this, right? Yeah, but we definitely see how many of the events, you know, a president ignoring the concept of a Supreme Court order, the president ignoring what's in the Constitution, you know, the inability to you know, to rein in a president that's exceeding his authority. All, you know, and I'm not just saying in the last 4 years, we've seen that over decades. The question is if it's continuous. The question is if it's malicious, or, you know, there's a lot of issues there. But what we're seeing is there are checks and balances, but most of it all depends on the will of the people at the same time. So with all that, I'm not seeing a lot of people unmute. So if you guys are through, I can let you go tonight, and I greatly appreciate you being here. Are you going to be here next week?
Oh yeah.
All right, good. I will too then. So it's a deal. So thank you all so much. I hope you all had a good night, and I will talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Thanks, Lois.
Thanks, Russ.
Good presentation
you.
again. Thanks.
Thanks, Carol.
Good
Thanks,
night.
Sue.